Hello, I'm Danny Musically. This presentation will introduce the Text Encoding Initiative and discuss its value for scholarly research in multidisciplinary fields. The Text Encoding Initiative, or TEI, is a schema for digitally describing and annotating texts. It can be applied in many content areas, though it is often associated with the humanities and linguistics. TEI supports many pursuits, including scholarly research, instruction at multiple levels, and preservation as part of digital projects. The schema is for more than just transcribing texts into digital documents. It provides a framework for creating metadata and encoding structural features of texts to enable dynamic search of documents for data retrieval, analysis, and display. The TEI Consortium provides documentation on the schema, including detailed guidelines for its use with many different document types. They also include archives of previous versions of these guidelines and information on customizations that have been developed. The schema uses XML elements and attributes to describe and annotate texts, and it includes a very rich tag set that enables the encoding of essentially any genre of text from any period of time in any language. It does have limitations, which I'll discuss later, but this is the goal. TEI makes use of XML as a full language. The current guidelines include almost 600 element options, though much fewer than that are actually routinely used. They are primarily categorized into metadata elements, such as authorship and bibliographic information, and structural elements, such as headings, paragraphs, and quotations. The schema is modular. Certain common document types have a prescribed set of relevant features. For example, there are certain elements that are more useful for performative texts, poetry, or dictionaries than for other types of documents. It is also extensible, so elements can be added, redefined, and renamed to customize encoding projects. The Text Encoding Initiative began in the 80s and is support from a fairly large group of organizations. The objective was to develop, maintain, and promulgate hardware and software independent methods for encoding humanities data in electronic form. With funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, 3 computing and humanities associations met at Vassar College in 1987 to develop these methods. They spent several years developing and revising a draft of the guidelines for encoding digital texts, and version 1, or P3, was published in 1994. Several years later, the TEI Consortium was created as an international membership organization to keep the TEI democratic, independent, self-sustaining, and nonprofit. They published P4 in the early 2000s to include an XML version of the guidelines, and then they spent the next several years revising the content. The current version of the guidelines is P5. As previously mentioned, one of the major goals was to create encoding methods that were independent of software. They needed to be applicable in many contexts, partly because there were too many different systems, and partly because the technology was changing so rapidly. Software vendors were using proprietary formats that shut down interoperability, and they did not prioritize longevity. The TEI's development supersedes those formats and supports long-term preservation and compatibility across different systems. It also promotes collaborative research by supporting the sharing of textual data in addition to its creation and preservation. A number of universities and associations directly support or endorse the TEI. Those part of its initiation included the Association for Computers and the Humanities, the Association for Computational Linguistics, and the European Association for Digital Humanities. The Digital Library Federation more recently produced the best practices for TEI metadata interoperability with other standards. The 500 plus XML elements of the Text Encoding Initiative afford a great deal of flexibility in encoding for different tasks, purposes, and audiences. The different customizations and modules improve ease of use in making the encoding process more streamlined. The core module includes much fewer elements, only those that are common to all TEI documents, regardless of document type. All of these elements may not be used for every text, but they are potentially applicable to any text depending on the context. Some of these are metadata elements like author, date, editor, etc., and others are structural and syntactical elements like abbreviation, milestone, quote, and stage directions. The first edition of the TEI guidelines included 8 basic tag sets for different document types. The verse tag set included elements like line group and line to map poetic structure. These elements wouldn't typically be used in prose documents, which are usually organized in paragraphs. The drama tag set included elements like speaker and stage directions. Again, these are fairly specific to this document type and will be less common in others. The current edition of the guidelines has specific recommendations for several text structures similar to the previous tag sets. The default text structure defines a shorter list of elements that describe the high-level structure of a text. Elements from other text structures will stack on top of this one to include more specific information. The XML document begins with a TEI header, which groups together metadata about the encoded text. The basic structure includes front matter, body, and back matter, and the default structure provides for simple divisions of information within those segments. Other modules afford more specificity with the elements. The performance text module, for example, includes special front matter like cast lists, as well as structural divisions like acts and scenes, speeches, and stage directions. Other elements address technical information like lighting and sound, and characteristics of specific types of performances, including screenplays and radio scripts. The dictionaries module guides encoding of lexical resources with elements like entry, grammatical information, part of speech, usage, stress, and syllable. The manuscript description module likewise includes highly specific elements for encoding manuscripts. This particular module was designed with medieval European manuscripts in mind, which is a limitation that I'll discuss later, but elements can be extended to materials outside of this context. The guidelines state that this module is potentially useful for any kind of text-bearing artifact. It also makes affordances for many different encoding objectives. The elements in these modules are highly specific and allow for careful encoding that enables effective search and information retrieval based on different document types. Several customizations have been developed by the consortium and include variations of certain modules, simplifications of the overall TEI, and combinations with other XML languages. The greater TEI community has also developed some customizations, including a best practices document for libraries. These customizations provide guidance on digitization, encoding workflows, and interoperability. One customization from the consortium is called Light, because it is a simplified version of the schema using the more frequently used elements. Obviously, this is still a hefty list of more than 100 elements, but it provides a much shorter list than the full nearly 600. It includes elements from multiple modules, such as stage directions from performance texts, line group from verse, and language usage from dictionaries. It does exclude many of the more highly specific elements. Another customization is called Bare. It includes only very basic structural and metadata elements that can apply to many different document types at a fairly high level. Overall, the TEI is a very dynamic schema. The seemingly infinite combinations of elements in the different modules and customizations make the TEI extremely flexible for different needs. Text can be encoded using the Bare or Light customizations when included in multimedia repositories that don't need highly specific metadata about the document structures. Genre-specific encoding is supported by the different modules for varying levels of granularity depending on project goals. That being said, it can also be overwhelming. It would be important to identify the goals and appropriate modules or customizations ahead of time to provide for maximum standardization in the encoding process. Multiple encoders working on the same project may not use the same elements if the module is not specified clearly. The massive list of options may also prove to be more challenging than flexible, again highlighting the importance of using or creating modules or customizations that are appropriate for the specific project's needs. Another strength is the interdisciplinary nature of the schema. The TEI was born out of scholarly research needs at the intersection of linguistics, computing and information science, and the humanities, and it can be applied to other fields as well. There are limits here, however, because of the Anglo-centric nature of the schema. It is designed around English and European texts, and the structural elements reflect these cultural and linguistic traditions. Texts from other parts of the world have varying structures, and encoding projects have different needs. Researchers working in languages other than English have identified challenges in applying the TEI to texts in their languages and from other cultural traditions. Ale Torrent and Del Rio Viande noted that in addition to the language, the textual critical traditions represented in the TEI are Anglo-centric as well. Thus, approaches to text are very different in other contexts. Their example was in the Hispanic contexts. And the teaching TEI in these other settings requires different practices. They argue that use of the TEI should adapt in different linguistic and cultural circumstances, rather than holding diverse texts to the structural elements of only Anglo-American and British contexts. Overall, despite these limitations, there is significant added value in encoding texts using the TEI. It provides valuable metadata that supports research and inquiry in many contexts, and it expands on the ability to search for information within documents or sections of those documents. Once a schema, module, or customization is selected, implementing the TEI is fairly straightforward. The elements used in the TEI describe the characteristics of a text, which includes bibliographic information, text structure, typographical elements, and annotations either appearing in the text or added by the encoder. This enables software to search the document more effectively. Depending on how the document is encoded, the search can go far beyond a simple word count or Control F. For example, you could limit your search to one chapter, or view a quote from a play in the context of a scene, or search within the lines of one specific character. It also allows software to display documents in a specific way, much like HTML and CSS instruct software how to display web pages. Essentially, the TEI is used to make a text more intelligible to a computer. It is not meant to be read by humans. This can then improve our research, education, and preservation efforts. In order to encode a text, it has to be digitized first. Encoding isn't just creating metadata about a document. It is embedding metadata in the text to make the document readable by a computer. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Digital Research in the Humanities identifies two primary methods for digitizing documents for encoding. First, manually typing the document into a text editor, or second, scanning the document using optical character recognition, or OCR software. Either way, it is important to maintain the original format and typographical features. Once the text is digitized, it can be encoded using the TEI schema. The complexity of this step will depend on the project goals. Once the document is encoded, appropriate software will be able to interpret the document. It can search the XML tags like database fields, and it could use the tags as instructions for how to display the document to readers and make it usable in the user interface. To recap, the metadata encoded in the document should include bibliographic or document-level information, as well as structural features of the text. It can include more specific textual features depending on the task, purpose, and audience. Let's take a look at an example. The Folger Shakespeare Library underwent a metadata project with their digital editions of Shakespeare's plays. They encoded each play using the TEI and identified primarily structural and character metadata. They also included a tag guide explaining each element they used. So here we're looking at the XML style sheet for Macbeth. The TEI header includes bibliographic data like the title, author, editors, encoders, and publishers. The header also contains a detailed project description with explanations of the XML elements that were used. So that's what we have here. The cast list is included in the header as well, and they've added custom IDs and sex for each character. You can see that here. So King Duncan is identified with his unique ID, the description of who he is in the play, and they've added the sex of each character as well, and some other metadata about what happens to the character in the play. The text section includes front matter like the introduction and synopsis. And then it moves into the actual document body. Act 1, Scene 1 begins here. Stage directions and sound elements are included, has their own tags. And when the dialogue begins, every speaker and each word they say is encoded separately with its own ID. And the punctuation and line breaks between words are encoded as well. I cannot imagine how much time this takes to complete manually. Each line and page is its own milestone element. This seems to be highly specific encoding that would allow for many different ways to search and analyze data within the text. The following papers explore different ways to use TEI for metadata preservation and information retrieval. Wilhelm et al. Used the Folger XML files, like the one we just looked at, to create a web tool for quantitative analysis and data visualization for characteristics of Shakespeare's plays. This data visualization enables analysis at varying levels of granularity. You can see the main character's speech over the course of the entire play here, and the graph creates an interesting visual synopsis of the characters' interactions and distribution within the play as a whole, within each act, or within each scene. This is, of course, enabled by the character metadata from the Folger Library's encoded document for Hamlet in this case. This data is also gathered based on the metadata in the XML document. On the right, the beginning of Hamlet's famous to be or not to be speech is included with statistics. This speech represents only 2.25% of Hamlet's total lines in the play. He definitely talks a lot. Wilhelm et al. Discussed the implications and uses of this kind of data in a variety of contexts. It can, for example, drive inquiry and collaboration in classroom settings by having students analyze these quantitative properties of the play. It can also help directors determine how many actors are needed for a production based on the number of characters who are present on the stage at one time. And it can drive scholarly research and criticism based on the statistics generated from this metadata. And of course, Shakespeare is not the only use for the TEI in practice. Arneal used the TEI to support markup of non-conventional or obsolete kanji characters in mid-20th century documents about the Japanese Canadian community. Hershenson and Rabin explored how the Bowling Green State University Library's technical services team could collaborate with the Center for Archival Collections to encode World War I letters and manage the downsizing of print collections. Newman et al. Started a project to encode Isaac Newton's alchemical manuscripts, including a variety of document types. This project enabled several viewing options for the documents, as well as scholarly analysis tools. They noted it was particularly difficult due to Newton's significant use of abbreviations, annotations, drawings, and special symbols. And many of those symbols have since been added to Unicode 6.0 because of this project. Nali and Del Grosso used the TEI to digitize and encode a medieval Arabic dictionary, and the schema enabled descriptions of lexical and morphological features of the words, as well as descriptions of the primary sources. And Holmes proposed a TEI schema and guidelines for encoding components of cryptic clues and solutions in crossword puzzles. So clearly there is a wide variety of uses for the TEI in linguistics and the humanities. Thank you so much for listening. These sources will help demonstrate how to use TEI, how it has evolved, and how it can be applied to specific projects. Many of the sources discuss the value of the TEI in different contexts. Others are specific pages from the TEI website summarizing information about the guidelines. And the specific projects discussed earlier in the presentation are cited on these slides as well. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.